Welcome to EWTN's ongoing series on Humanae Vitae, the encyclical of Pope Paul VI on human life. Our guest in this program is Bishop Rene Gracida of Corpus Christi. We'll be discussing the content, the actual meaning of the encyclical Humanae Vitae. Please stay tuned. Bishop Gracida, thanks very much for being a part of this series on Humanae Vitae.
My pleasure, Father.
We appreciate a bishop with your busy schedule taking time out to do this. So let's jump right into things. This encyclical Humanae Vitae has been a very controversial encyclical, so it's good to find out what exactly are the contents of Humanae Vitae.
I agree. I suspect that there's been an awful lot written and spoken about the encyclical by people who have never really read it and are not familiar with its contents, who trust the interpretation of the encyclical, which they've read elsewhere, rather than going to the text itself.
It's a beautiful text, really.
It is a beautiful text. It deals, of course, as the title suggests, with human life, and it is an important teaching of the Church on the subject of human life.
Okay, and it has three parts to it, doesn't it? Three major parts.
Yes.
What would those be?
Well, first of all, the Pope Paul, sought to establish the reason for the encyclical. That is that the situation changed in the world significantly in previous decades, and that, secondly, the Church has competence to teach on this particular subject. And so the first part is primarily an exposition of the questions that have been raised, the need for these questions to be answered by the Church, and the competence of the Church in answering the questions. Okay. The second part deals with the doctrinal basis of the Church's teaching, and the third part contains some pastoral exhortations to various sectors or members of the Church.
Good. And you mentioned now the first part has some of these new questions which prompted the issuance of the encyclical. What are some of those new questions that he wrote about?
Well, one of the most important at the time, and still is for that matter, but at the time it had a prominence which made it perhaps the leading question of that decade, and it had to do with the population explosion. The theories of Malthus and the Malthusian projection that at some point in the not-too-distant future, the world would simply be overcrowded to the point where human life would no longer be capable of being sustained. And so there were a lot of theories being advanced as to the causes of overpopulation and the remedy for overpopulation. And since some of those remedies involved either mass sterilization or enforced abortion by state governments, or the new technologies, especially the inovulant pill, caused the Pope to say that these new questions which are being raised, which had not been raised in the same way in earlier generations, necessitated the Pope and the Church addressing the questions.
Okay. And so he really felt that as the spokesman for the Church, he had to address these questions, didn't he?
Absolutely.
He just couldn't let them stay out there just lying without an answer, didn't he?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I recall that an editorial in a secular paper in the diocese where I was at the time blamed the Pope specifically for the tremendous poverty of Latin America, because they said that the Church and the Pope were opposing birth control, and therefore the population explosion in Latin America was the direct responsibility of the Church. Well, this kind of attack on the credibility of the Church and the teaching authority of the Church I think was the impetus for the Pope to address.
So was that perhaps the most important of the new questions that he felt he had to address, you think?
He listed it as the first of the questions
Yes.
in the encyclical, and therefore, since he gives it such a high visibility as the first question that was being asked, one can assume that it was important in his mind and in his thinking.
What were some of the other questions that he brought up as the new questions that needed responses?
Well, he was concerned about the trends with regard to housing, for example. In previous generations, housing was adequate for large families. Increasingly, housing, and we know that in this country, the size of the average family house began to decrease. After the Second World War, for example, Levittown and some of the other mass-produced housing that was constructed all over the United States, but particularly in New York and in California, some of that mass-produced housing really amounted to such small space that it was impossible for families to think realistically of 4, 5, or 6 children, because there simply would not be room. The houses were being designed for the nuclear family, husband, wife, and 1 child or 2 children at the most.
And he brought out something about the conditions or the way we look upon the person of woman today, too, didn't he, in that?
Yes, that was also linked with the changes in the workplace. With the rise of affluence and with the competition to acquire goods, consumerism, more and more families had both parents working. And as women entered the workplace, they began to feel the disadvantages of unequal pay, unequal working conditions. And so in the 50s and 60s, there began to arise militant feminism. And people began to view women and the role of women in such a radically different way that obviously when you talk about procreation, you obviously have to adjust your thinking to what society as a whole was now beginning to say about the nature of women, the role of women in society and in the family, and the demands of the changing conditions in the workplace for working women.
Okay. Well, it could be asked, why didn't the Pope let the social scientists address these issues and keep the church out of them?
Well, he pays, in the encyclical, he pays due respect to the contributions which social sciences have made to answering these questions and to analyzing these questions. But since social scientists are always working within the limitations of their respective fields, the Pope felt that their answers would always be fragmented and limited in scope and could never address the totality of the human person. And the Pope in the encyclical clearly states that it is the total human person that the Church must be concerned with, that God created man and woman in a total relationship with each other and with God and with life and with the world. And therefore to dissect human nature or to dissect the role of an individual person, whether male or female, in society, solely from the standpoint of psychology or sociology or any of the other social sciences, would necessarily result in a flawed, imperfect, and partial solution to problems.
So basically he would take in the findings of these sciences, but then put them all into the whole picture, which would include theology, God's view of man and man's ultimate goal, right?
Working with philosophy as the basic tool, he would take the contributions of all these individual social sciences and scientists and would assimilate them within the framework of the revelation which God has made about the nature of man, woman, and society. And therefore there would be a theological framework of reference for the solution which he would propose.
Which we really need. Now, the Second Vatican Council in its Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, did speak about this issue. Why did the Pope just not let that be? Why did he want to further specify that?
Well, we don't know for certain. There have been a number of theories proposed, one of which is that during the course of the council sessions, there were a number of interventions made by leading churchmen, several cardinals, for example, which seemed to indicate a call for a radical change in the Church's teaching with regard to procreation, contraception, the fundamental relationship of the spouses. This was never explicitly stated by these churchmen in their interventions, but when one goes back and reads, that there is a tone, there is an underlying theme which seems to be present. Perhaps Pope Paul VI was alarmed by that. And then, since Pope John the 23rd had appointed a commission to study the family, the relationship between the sexes, procreation and contraception, Pope Paul VI evidently saw an opportunity to take the matter out of the council and to put it into the hands of this expanded commission. The commission, I think, was expanded by him to include almost more than 60 people, and these were cardinals, bishops, priests, certainly theologians and periti of various expertise. It included doctors, it included social scientists, it included, above all, married couples. And so I guess the Pope felt that this large body, this commission, consisting of over 60 people, would be in a better position to discern what the questions were and to bring forward the research of all of these different scientists and others, and to present to him their conclusions so that he might form an answer to these vexing questions for the Church in a document which he would issue after the council ended.
And would it be your understanding, Bishop, that the primary thing he wanted them to look at, say first John the 23rd and then Pope Paul VI, was the whole emergence of the inovulant pill? Or would it be your understanding that from the beginning they wanted to kind of just take a look at the whole Church teaching on contraception in general? It's
not clear. In the allocutions, the speeches that the Pope made to that commission during the period of time that they were conducting their study, he never clearly spelled out what he expected from the commission. Rather, he kept focusing upon the broad question of family life, marital life, conjugal life, the problem of procreation as society defines the problems, and especially now in the light of such things as the pill, the problem of contraception. So while he never focused upon any one aspect of all of these different total far-ranging complexes of problems having to do with family life, it's reasonable to assume that the pill and other problems having to do with contraception were very much a part of the picture.
Okay. Now, the council gave, this special commission gave a report back to the Holy Father with a minority report and a majority report. And
that's disputed.
Oh, is that disputed? Okay.
That's disputed. You see, the commission gave a final report, which has never been made public.
Oh, okay.
So we don't know what the final report contains. We do know that there were several appendices attached to the final report. And we know that draft copies of two of those appendices, and there were several, but two of the appendices, draft copies, were leaked. They appeared in the Tablet in England, and they appeared in the National Catholic Reporter in the United States. Now, they were draft copies of two of the several appendices.
And by draft copies, not the final copy, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Not even final copies of the appendices.
Okay.
And the appendices were written by a majority of the members of the commission, and another appendix by a minority of. Now, those two appendices have come to be known as the majority-minority report.
Okay.
But in reality, they're not. The Pope received the final report of the commission, and it has never been made public.
Okay. Now, why did the Pope not just ratify the report of that special commission? Why did he go on to write the encyclical?
Because the commission was itself seriously divided. Of the 60 members, we don't know the percentages or the numbers, but it was obvious that from the appendices, for example, it was obvious that there were serious disagreements between some of the theologians, between some of the cardinals, between some of the bishops, and others. And so the Pope realized, I'm sure, when he got the report, that this was not something that could be ratified by him and have it stand as a declaration of the magisterium. He would have to write his own encyclical, his own teaching on the subject. And so, yes, we have this document, which is Humanae Vitae of Human Life, which was the encyclical issued by Pope Paul VI.
And actually, in the first part, he mentions that it was his duty not simply to take the report of the commission,
Yes.
but as the one commissioned by Christ to speak out. He was the one that ultimately had to do that, right?
It was the questions were so serious, so complex, so controverted, that there is no way that the Pope could delegate to others the responsibility for preparing a teaching document on that subject.
Which was really ultimately his responsibility.
His responsibility.
Right? Okay. In our next program, we're going to be discussing the doctrinal principles. Would you care, in the time that we have left in this, to kind of see the responses that the Pope gave to these various questions that came up? For example, how his answers impact on for example, on the population increase, and we could go through these other questions. What did the Pope say in this encyclical ultimately to the problem that was presented to him by the modern world of the concern about a so-called population explosion?
Well, certainly the Pope stressed the freedom of couples to determine for themselves the size of their families, and he condemned the idea that state had a right to interject itself into the question of family life and family size to that extent that it would, as for example, we know in India and China, adopt programs of population control which employ, for example, sterilization, involuntary sterilization of individuals, whether male or female, which involve the abortion of a third or fourth child, limiting family size to just 2 infants. So the Pope in his doctrine on population, first of all, rejects the idea that population increase of itself is going to spell the end of the world. He points to the inequality of the distribution of wealth. He points to the problem of poor nations versus rich nations in terms of their development and their need to benefit from and profit from the natural resources which are part of their country but which are exploited by the first world.
So he really denies that artificial contraception would solve the problem of overpopulation, and of course there are those who deny that we really are experiencing overpopulation, where some of the countries in the West are really decreasing in population, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. Some of the countries in Europe have fallen below the reproductive level necessary to sustain their native populations. And so if it were not for immigration from the Mediterranean northward into Germany and France and some of the other countries, those populations would actually be shrinking.
Interesting. And he was really prophetic, wasn't he, in warning about the dangers of governments doing the very thing you were just mentioning, you know, of coming in with sterilization and abortion and so on.
He saw it. He saw it coming. He knew that as the means of artificial contraception became perfected in terms of science
Yes.
and in terms of technology, that it would be very easy for governments, especially, it doesn't use the word, but obviously government bureaucrats, government technicians, government apparatchiks, to take these scientific advances and employ them wholesale in order to achieve some goal with regard to population control.
And how does the answer, the dogmatic answers that he gives in this encyclical, how do they impact on this whole question that you brought up, that he brought up, you know, about the housing question, the way we look on the person of woman in today's society and so on?
Well, the whole question, of course, of militant feminism and the changing role of women had not reached the point yet where it was critical in terms of the impact upon society, which we now see in our own time that militant feminism has had in, for example, the destruction of the family or family life, the whole problem of abortion reaching the level that it has in our country because of, quote, women's right to choose, you know. So the Pope stresses rather the relationship between man and woman, the fact that both find their ultimate destiny, their ultimate happiness, the ultimate fulfillment within the framework of marriage, and that it is in the conjugal life shared together that man and woman are most capable of finding the ultimate realization of what it is to be a child of God and to be joined with God in that relationship. He doesn't use the expression, but as I read and reread the encyclical the other day, I couldn't help but note where he talks about that God is always involved in conjugal love, the famous phrase of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, which he liked to use frequently, and that is, it takes three to make love.
Beautiful.
It takes three to make love, God, husband, and wife.
That's beautiful. Does he say anything about the housing situation? You know, you mentioned about the way houses are built. I guess not only in the United States, but in many countries of the world, you have these big housing projects and just not room for large families. Did he directly say anything to that in the encyclical?
Yes, he reminded government and he reminded the private sector that they had an obligation to society and to the continuation of the well-being of society, not to force the artificial restriction of family size by making it impossible for people to find adequate housing for more than a nuclear family.
So what he was doing, he was saying that governments have a responsibility to provide adequate housing for families that are larger than the nuclear family.
Well, he didn't go that far. He didn't go so far as to say that governments have the responsibility to provide, but he's suggesting that governments have the responsibility to see to it that the housing is provided. Now, that doesn't imply socialism. It doesn't imply anything more than that governments will stimulate maybe the private sector to do what has to be done.
But at least the government would be involved in that whole process in some way or another.
Yes.
Okay. In our third of these three programs that we're going to get into, we're going to speak about the pastoral aspects of this encyclical.
Yes.
But in the 3 or 4 minutes remaining to us right now, would you have some kind of words of hope, even if you're anticipating a little bit our third program, that you could offer to couples and to prospective couples in our viewing audience as they, you know, are looking at the teaching of the church and in many cases really struggling to do it? You as a bishop with much pastoral experience, what words of hope and encouragement would you want to give to them?
Well, if you'd asked me that question a year ago, I don't think I would have expressed as much hope as I can express now. And the reason for my increase in hope is the publication of the Catholic Catechism, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and also the publication of Veritatis Splendor,
the new encyclical of
the new encyclical of Pope John Paul II. Those two documents are essentially linked. The Pope says in Veritatis Splendor that the Catechism of the Catholic Church contains in more direct and popular expression, the application of the truths contained in his encyclical. And correspondingly, the encyclical contains magnificent presentation of the philosophical and theological principles which support the traditional teaching of the Church with regard to moral norms. And therefore, with this clear teaching on the part of Pope John Paul II contained in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor, which is addressed to bishops, so that we have the obligation of ensuring that the correct teaching is now clearly carried out in our dioceses, and with the publication of the Catechism, which is going to be in the hands of the faithful, these two documents, one in the hands of the bishops, the other in the hands of the faithful, together I think, give reason for hope that what Pope Paul VI said in Humanae Vitae will now be revisited and reviewed, and I hope accepted by many more people than it has been in the past.
You know, as a priest myself, we've been reading the encyclical in Spanish, since it isn't out in English yet.
Yes.
I have found it such a wonderful...
You mean the catechism?
The catechism, excuse me, the catechism in Spanish, yes. I have found that such a rich source for meditation, for teaching, for preaching. My hope is that that will encourage priests to speak out more on this, and not to look on the teaching of Humanae Vitae as something binding, but as a wonderful, freeing, liberating thing for people, and just the whole of Catholic truth, you know.
That's my hope also. When we talk about the third sector of the encyclical Humanae Vitae, I'll have an opportunity then to talk more about the change that I hope will take place in the preaching of priests. They were, I think, very timid, very apprehensive about preaching Humanae Vitae in the past. But I hope now, using the catechism as the syllabus, as it were, for their preaching, they will find it possible, it's certainly easier, to preach Humanae Vitae than they did 25 years ago.
Just a word of encouragement to priests. I've talked to just a few priests who openly will speak about Humanae Vitae, and the people respond very well.
Yes.
You know, they haven't heard it, and they're eager to get the teaching, they're eager to get the truth. And so, for my brother priests, I encourage you, don't be afraid to preach out. Preach lovingly, preach with the pastoral guidelines there, and people would be glad to accept the truth. Bishop, thank you so much. I'd love for you to give a blessing to our viewing audience as we wrap this program up, would you?
It'd be my pleasure and privilege. May the blessings of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit come upon all of you who have been joined with us in this program this day, now and forever.
Thank you very much, Bishop. And in our next program, we'll continue this series on Humanae Vitae, and we'll be speaking then about the doctrinal principles that the Holy Father sets out in the encyclical. We really hope that this is a source of joy, of truth, and of inspiration and hope to all of you who are following us in this series. God bless you.